Despite being born into slavery and initially forbidden from learning to read or write, Douglass became one of the most eloquent and persuasive speakers of the 19th century. His ability to craft speeches with logical arguments, emotional appeals, and vivid imagery set a standard for oratory that influenced later civil rights leaders and public speakers. His speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," is one of the greatest in American history. Delivered on July 5, 1852, this speech is a masterclass in rhetorical structure, irony, and moral argumentation. Douglass challenged his audience by juxtaposing American ideals with the realities of slavery, using a measured yet powerful tone that showcased his skill in timing, emphasis, and audience engagement. The speech remains a cornerstone of American political oratory. He revolutionized the role of the formerly enslaved as public intellectuals. Before Douglass, few formerly enslaved people were given serious platforms to speak. He defied stereotypes, proving that Black men and women could engage in intellectual debates and influence policy. His speeches and writings changed how people viewed Black Americans' capacity for leadership, education, and civic engagement. He knew how to use his voice and presence to command attention. Douglass had a deep, resonant voice and a powerful stage presence, which were crucial to his effectiveness as an orator. His use of pause, inflection, and modulation allowed him to captivate audiences across the U.S. and Europe, even at a time when many were hostile to his message. His ability to read the room and adjust his delivery is still studied in public speaking and leadership courses today. He pioneered communication strategies that influenced modern activism. Douglass mastered the art of storytelling in activism, blending personal experience with broader societal critiques. He also understood media and public relations, founding newspapers like the North Star to control his own narrative rather than relying on white-owned presses. His approach to spreading ideas foreshadowed how modern movements use social media, journalism, and public speaking to drive change. Why he matters beyond Black history. Frederick Douglass is not just a historical figure for Black history. He is a foundational figure in the history of American rhetoric, political communication, and advocacy. His ability to move audiences, challenge institutions, and reshape public discourse makes him essential for understanding the evolution of speechmaking, activism, and leadership. His legacy continues to influence public speaking, from the civil rights movement to today's political and social movements. An American observer recalled Douglass's presence as a speaker. He was more than 6 feet in height, and his majestic form, as he rose to speak, straight as an arrow, muscular yet lithe and graceful. His flashing eye, and more than all, his voice, that rivaled Webster's in its richness and in the depth and sonorousness of its cadences, made up such an ideal of an orator as the listeners never forgot. Advocacy for women's rights. He attended the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. He believed that rights should be universal, not limited by race or gender. Relationship with Abraham Lincoln. He was an advisor to President Abraham Lincoln. He met Lincoln in the White House 3 times. He came to view Lincoln as emphatically the Black man's president. Other notable moments: he recruited African American soldiers to fight in the Union Army. He spoke at the Baltimore celebration of the ratification of the 15th Amendment. He held official appointments from Presidents Hayes, Garfield, and Harrison. On August 3, 1857, Frederick Douglass delivered a West India Emancipation Speech at Canandaigua, New York, on the 23rd anniversary of the event. Most of the address was a history of British efforts toward emancipation, as well as a reminder of the crucial role of the West Indian slaves in that own freedom struggle. However, shortly after he began, Douglass sounded a foretelling of the coming Civil War when he uttered 2 paragraphs that became the most quoted sentences of all of his public orations. They began with the words, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress."
The general sentiment of mankind is that a man who will not fight for himself when he has the means of doing so is not worth being fought for by others. And this sentiment is just. For a man who does not value freedom for himself will never value it for others or put himself to any inconvenience to gain it for others. Such a man, the world says, may lie down until he has sense enough to stand up. It is useless and cruel to put a man on his legs if the next moment his head is to be brought against a curbstone. A man of that type will never lay the world under any obligation to him, but will be a moral pauper, a drag on the wheels of society. And if he too be identified with a peculiar variety of the race, he will entail disgrace upon his race as well as upon himself. The world in which we live is very accommodating to all sorts of people. It will cooperate with them in any measure which they propose. It will help those who earnestly help themselves. It will hinder those who hinder themselves. It is very polite and never offers its services unasked. Its favors to individuals are measured by an inerrant principle in this, viz., respect those who respect themselves and despise those who despise themselves. It is not within the power of unaided human nature to persevere in pitying a people who are insensible to their own wrongs and indifferent to the attainment of their own rights. The poet was as true to common sense as to poetry when he said, "Who would be free themselves must strike the blow." When O'Connell, with all Ireland in his back, was supposed to be contending for the just rights and liberties of Ireland, the sympathies of mankind were with him, and even his enemies were compelled to respect his patriotism. Kossuth, fighting for Hungary with his pen long after she had fallen by the sword, commanded the sympathy and support of the liberal world till his own hopes died out. The Turks, while they fought bravely for themselves and scourged and drove back the invading legions of Russia, shared the admiration of mankind. They were standing up for their own rights against an arrogant and powerful enemy, but as soon as they let out their fighting to the Allies, admiration gave way to contempt. These are not the maxims and teachings of a cold-hearted world. Christianity itself teaches that man shall provide for his own house. This covers the whole ground of nations as well as individuals. Nations, no more than individuals, can innocently be improvident. They should provide for all wants, mental, moral, and religious, and against all evils to which they are liable as nations. In the great struggle now progressing for the freedom and elevation of our people, we should be found at work with all our might, resolve that no man or set of men shall be more abundant in labors according to the measure of our ability than ourselves. I know, my friends, that in some quarters the efforts of colored people meet with very little encouragement. We may fight, but we must fight like the sepoys of India under white officers. This class of abolitionists don't like colored celebrations. They don't like colored conventions. They don't like colored anti-slavery flares for the support of colored newspapers. They don't like any demonstrations, whatever, in which colored men take a leading part. They talk of proud Anglo-Saxon blood as flippantly as those who profess to believe in the natural inferiority of races. Your humble speaker has been branded as an ingrate because he has ventured to stand up on his own and to plead our common cause as a colored man rather than as a garrison. I hold it to be no part of gratitude to allow our white friends to do all the work while we merely hold their coats. Opposition of the sort now referred to as partisan position, and we need not mind it. The white people at large will not largely be influenced by it. They will see and appreciate all honest efforts on our parts to improve our condition as a people. Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all observing, and for the time being, putting all the tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet to appreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and it never did, and it never will. Find out just that any people will quietly submit to you, and you will find out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. In the light of those ideas, Negroes will be hunted at the north, held and flogged at the south, so long as they submit to those devilish outrages and make no resistance, either moral or physical. Men may not get all they pay for in this world, but they must certainly pay for all they get. If we ever get free from the oppressions and wrongings heaped upon us, we must pay for their removal. We must do this by labor, by suffering, by sacrifice, and if need be, by our lives and the lives of others. Hence, my friends, every mother who, like Margaret Garner, plunges a knife into the bosom of her infant to save it from the hell of her Christian slavery should be held and honored as a benefactress. Every fugitive from slavery who, like the noble William Thomas at Wilkes-Barre, prefers to perish in a river made red by his own blood to submission to the hellhounds who were hunting and shooting him should be esteemed as a glorious martyr, worthy be held in grateful memory by our people. The fugitive Horace at Mecklenburg, Ohio, the other day, who taught the slave catchers from Kentucky that it was safer to arrest white men than to arrest him, did a most excellent service to our cause. Parker and his noble band of 15th at Christiana, who defended themselves from the kidnappers with prayers and pistols, are entitled to the honor of making this first successful resistance to the Fugitive Slave Bill. But for that resistance and the rescue of Jerry and Shadrach, the man hunters who would have hunted our hills and valleys here with the same freedom with which they now hunt their own dismal swamps. There was an important lesson in the conduct of the noble Crawman in New York the other day, who supposed that the American Christians were about to enslave him, betook himself to the masthead, and with knife in hand said he would cut his throat before he would be made a slave. Joseph Sink on the deck of the Amistad did that which should be made his name dear to us, bore nature's burning protest against slavery. Madison Washington, who struck down his oppressor on the decks of the Creole, is more worthy to be remembered than the colored man who shot Pitcairn at Bunker Hill. My friends who will observe that I've taken a wide range, and you think it is about time that I should answer this special objection to this celebration, I do so too. This, then, is the truth concerning the inauguration of freedom in the British West Indies. Abolition was the act of the British government. The motive which led the government to act on doubt was mainly a philanthropic one, entitled to our highest admiration and gratitude. The nation religion, the justice and humanity cried out in thunderous indignation against the foul abomination, and the government yielded to the storm. Nevertheless, a share of the credit of the result falls justly to the slaves themselves. Those slaves, they were rebellious slaves. They bore themselves well. They did not hug their chains, but according to the opportunities, swelled the general protest against oppression. What Wilberforce was endearing to win from the British Senate by his magic eloquence, the slaves themselves were endearing to gain by outbreaks and violence. The combined action of one and the other will wrought out the final result. While one showed the slave was wrong, the other showed that it was dangerous as well as wrong. Mr. Wilberforce, peaceman that he was, and a model of piety, availed himself of this element to strengthen his case before the British Parliament and warn the British government of the danger of continuing slavery in the West Indies. There is no doubt that the fear of the consequence, acting with the sense of the moral evil of slavery, led to its abolition. The spirit of the freedom was broad in the islands. Insurrection for the freedom kept the planters in a constant state of alarm and trepidation. A standing army was necessary to keep the slaves in their chains. The state of facts could not be without weight in deciding the question of freedom in these countries. I will now recite the speech in its entirety. I am aware that the rebellious disposition of the slaves was said to arise out of this discussion which the abolitionists were carrying on at home, and is not necessary to refute the alleged explanation. All that I contend for is this, that the slaves of the West Indies did fight for their freedom, and the fact of their discontent was known in England, and that it was assisted in bringing about the state of public opinion which finally resulted in their emancipation. And if this be true, the objection is answered. Again, I am aware that the insurrectionary movements of the slaves were held by many to be prejudicial to their cause. This is said now of such movements at the South. The answer is that the abolition followed close on the heels of insurrection in the West Indies, and Virginia was never nearer emancipation than General Turner kindled the fires of insurrection in Southampton. Sir, I have now more than filled up the measure of my time. I thank you for the patient attention given to what I've said to say. Excuse me, for the patient attention given to what I have had to say. I have aimed, as I've said at the beginning, to expose a few thoughts having some relation to the great interests of freedom, both in this country and in the British West Indies. And I've said all that I mean to say, and this time will not permit me to say more. Thank you so much for taking time to learn about Frederick Douglass. I hope this lesson inspired you.